open. So, all right. Yeah, we might as well record now, right?
I just started to record and I did it on my computer.
Yeah, let me do that.
Doesn't get deleted in the cloud.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah. Man, it's good to have backups. I've had some weird things happen lately, technologically, so I don't know if it's the beginning of the year or what. Okay, let me open up let me admit everyone here who's waiting. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Just getting everyone in, getting our settings correct, and we'll get started in a few minutes. All right, great. Yeah, and as you join, just so you know, we're trying to maintain a kind of webinar quality to this. So please refrain from using your video. And if you do have your video turned on, I'm just going to force turn it off, just so you know. So hopefully during this session, the only person you'll be able to see is the speaker and myself at certain times. I also have adjusted the settings so that you are not able to unmute yourself. So if you do have any technical issues or need anything, please use the chat box before we get started and throughout the presentation. Great. Thanks, Laura, for the help there. All right, we've got lots of people coming in here. So let's just give it a couple more minutes. And then I have to start the difficult task of talking and pushing a button at the same time. But I can do it. All right. Well, let's get started. Again, this is where I have to do a little bit of double tasking, but I think I'll be able to do it just fine. I wanted to welcome everyone today. This is our first presentation in our Urban Agriculture Pest Management webinar series. This webinar series is coordinated by the Great Lakes Urban Agriculture IPM Working Group. This work is supported by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Crop Protection and Pest Management Program through the North Central IPM Center, and we thank them for their support. A couple of quick housekeeping items. So this presentation is being recorded and will be sent out at the end of the day on Friday. We are going to just continue with that pattern. So the presentation will be held on Wednesday, and we'll make sure that everyone has the recording by Friday. We'll do that until the final presentation on the 24th. And at that time, we'll send out all of the links again. So you have them all in one email, simply a simple reference there. So that's the idea for the recordings. I wanted to say, please note that the presentations are available through the Zoom link. And that means that these presentations will only be available for 60 days past the recording date. But we are working on getting these videos uploaded to another location where they'll be available beyond that date. Okay. Again, to provide a quick Zoom orientation, you may have noticed that some of your controls are controlled. Some of the settings are controlled. You won't be able to unmute yourself. So please use the chat box. If you do have a technical difficulty or want to get a clarification. We do this just to maintain the webinar quality. So everyone's going to be muted, and we also ask that you please keep your video off today. If you do have your video on, I'm just going to turn it off quickly. Let's see what else. Yep, use that chat box. At the end, we will use some time to ask questions. So please, if you do have a question, feel free to jot it down, or you can put it in the chat box, but we likely won't address the question until the end of the webinar. If it's a quick clarification, I might break in to ask a quick clarifying question on behalf of the audience, if that happens. But without further ado, let's get started. So our presenter today is Mary Rogers. Mary Rogers is an associate professor of sustainable and organic horticultural food production systems at the University of Minnesota. A horticultural entomologist, Mary's research focuses on integrated pest management and strategies to manage invasive insect species and improve production of vegetables and fruits for organic and local markets in the upper Midwest. So with that, I will turn it over to Mary, and she'll get started with her presentation. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Maggie. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe a thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm pleased to be here today to talk about Swede Midge. This little bugger has been really challenging for us recently, particularly in urban agricultural settings. So a lot of our community gardeners are struggling with it. We're seeing it in home gardens too. We haven't heard too much from our commercial veggie growers yet, but we expect that's really only a matter of time. So I'd also be curious to hear from you whether you're experiencing this pest, or maybe you suspect that this pest is present in your gardens as well. So I'm looking forward to maybe a just little discussion at the end of this. So let's talk about, starting at the beginning, what is Swede Midge? So Swede, you might think it refers to someone from Sweden or something from Sweden, but it refers to a rutabaga. So a Swede is what the folks in the UK call a rutabaga, and that's indicative of the type of crops that this insect likes to attack. So this is a fly in the Cecidomyiidae family. That's a hard one to say, but this is the gall midge family, and gall midges are known as small, delicate flies. They're about 2 to 3 millimeters in length, and they have a close association with their host plants. And their feeding results in abnormal kind of growth or the formation of galls. So they're intricately co-evolved with their host plants and their host plant physiology. So a lot of them tend to be specialists. And that's the case with Swede Midge. So these are specialists on the Brassica family. So we have a lot of important Brassica family crops that we grow in North America. Swede Midge was first found in North America in Ontario in the year 2000, and it was closely associated with canola. So it's originally from Eurasia. Somehow it got over here, landed in Canada and the Northeast US, and it's kind of been slowly spreading throughout the upper Midwest and the Northern territories in recent years. So I mentioned, I'll talk mostly about how this impacts vegetable crops, because those are the systems that I'm working on. But they like to feed on the growing points of plants. And so this is important for phenological reasons. We'll get into the damage in a little bit here. But it's an economic pest, most significant in organic and no spray systems. And maybe this is why we're starting to see it a lot more in urban areas. Maybe we're really good at spreading it around on transplants and whatnot and plant material, but we're also tend to not be spraying in urban agriculture. And so this could be why it's proliferating. So Swede midge is a very successful invasive pest species. Here I have on the left characteristics of successful invasive species. So in general, these are non-native. So invasive species tend to be non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration. And the introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm. So this is what we have in Swede midge. Small size species tend to be more successful at colonizing undetected, and it's just because they're smaller. So they tend to kind of fly under the radar until damage is done, and then we start to notice them. So that's also the case with Swede midge. They are able to reach high population levels fairly quickly. And this is the case with Swede midge as well. We have overlapping generations in one year, so 2 to 3 overlapping generations, and a short generational time. So under ideal environmental climate considerations, we can get from egg to adult in as little as 21 days, which is extremely quick. Successful invasive species lack natural predators. That's the case for Swede midge. We don't have any real biological control we can depend on. And I'll talk about that as we go on. And then, yeah, the detection, ability to spread undetected. So this is kind of related to small size, but also Swede midge is cryptic. It's hard to detect in almost any of its life cycles. So as an adult, it's very small. It's a delicate fly, hard to see. Larvae feed within the plant material and are very cryptic. And then the pupae develop in the soil, and they're hard to see there too. So we'll look at what these look like here. So here you can see an adult male. The adult males have long antennae, and they use their antennae to detect female sex pheromones. And so that's important when it comes to mating. So the males can sense where the females are early in the spring when they first emerge from the soil, and then they mate. The larvae, you can barely see this, but they're small, cream colored. They go through 3 developmental stages before pupating. In their prepupal stage, they'll fling themselves from the plant. It's kind of fun to see this in laboratory colonies in action, but they do fling themselves from the plant into the soil, and then they'll start the pupation process. And then as pupae, they kind of cover themselves. They have this sticky substance and they cover themselves with soil. So it kind of just looks like clods of soil here. Very difficult to see this in the soil, as you can imagine. They tend to be within the first 1 to 5 centimeters of the soil surface, and more commonly than not within those first 2 centimeters. So that's important when we think of maybe managing them in the soil. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the life cycle. I mentioned that they can develop from egg to adult in as little as 21 days. 21 to 44 days is common at these ideal kind of temperature settings. So between 66 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So soil moisture also plays a role in successful pupation. And they can last as pupae in the soil for up to 2 years. So this is important when we're thinking in terms of breaking the cycle or crop rotation. We've got to think of in infested fields, this is a 3-year period without any brassicas or host plants whatsoever, and at least 500 feet from another brassica field, as long as there's a barrier. Further, if there's no barrier. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But adults can live 1 to 5 days. They will feed on floral nectar, and when they mate, females can lay up to 100 eggs, in their lifetime. They usually lay them in clusters of 50, and they like to lay them on actively growing points of the plant. So if you're thinking broccoli, the buds that will eventually become the head or should become the head. And then they'll develop, the larvae develop in that plant material. They'll feed on the plant material, very hidden, often cryptic. You can't really see them unless you're digging around and maybe have some magnification or a hand lens. But they'll go through 3 larval instars and then fling themselves to pupate into the soil and then continue their development in the soil. They overwinter as pupae in the soil. So right now in the soil on our fields here, we have these pupae just waiting for the conditions to become ripe to emerge. All right, so distribution, I mentioned it was first reported in North America and Ontario in 2000. And the first report in the United States was in 2004 in New York. Since then, it has spread to many areas around the Great Lakes states. And in many cases, it's been first found in urban areas. And so when it was first found in Illinois, it was in Cook County, Milwaukee County in Wisconsin. In Ohio, it was found not far from Toledo. So we're seeing this close to urban areas. And it makes me think, although we don't know for sure, that maybe we are playing an important role in spreading it through transplants, perhaps, maybe in compost or soil, for example. So I think more work needs to be done in this area to see, how we can slow the spread. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit now about what the damage looks like. So pay close attention to this because I'm really curious to see if you've experienced any kind of damage that looks like this or that is suspicious in your garden sites. So it's part challenging because you can't, unlike a lot of other brassica pests, maybe you've experienced flea beetles or imported cabbage worm or cabbage loopers, diamondback moth, caterpillar pests. They're easy to see, right? You can go visually inspect your plants. You can see chewing holes. You can sometimes see frass. You can sometimes see eggs or the caterpillars actively feeding. You can't with these. And by the time you see the damage, the insect is long gone. So it's too late to try to intervene. The only thing you can do is think of the future crops or try to disrupt their cycles, because you do have those multiple generations in a season. So distorted growing tips. This should be a Romanesco broccoli, which should have a single nice uniform head. Right here we have these multiple heads in this weird distorted growth. Petioles and stems with brown scarring is another tell. And then sometimes you'll see on the leaves crumpled, twisted young leaves. And it's also difficult because this damage could often maybe looks like mechanical damage or nutrient disorder. So it's kind of hard. It's often, I think, misdiagnosed. But the scarring is definitely a tell. And so the best way to monitor it is this combination of, if you see suspicious looking symptoms on your brassicas that are like the images I just showed, you can trap. So we use these Jackson traps from Century Biological. And so these are triangular shaped. There's a sticky card in here. So adults will fly in, get stuck. And then we have a chemical lure. And the lure is synthetic female sex pheromone. So only the males will be caught in these traps. We don't have any sort of specific lure or attractant for females, which is also a limiting factor for this insect. The downsides are you have to kind of know what you're looking at. So it requires specialized knowledge for accurate ID. They are very small, like I mentioned before. Lures can be costly and time intensive. We trap and replace them weekly. So it's not something we're really recommending, gardeners start doing quite yet, but we might need some help from our extension IPM specialists, folks who know a little bit of entomology and can help with diagnostics if you suspect it in your garden. All right, so what vegetables does Swede Midge like? So I mentioned it's a specialist on brassica. We have a lot of different Brassica oleracea crops. So it tends to go for subtypes of oleracea, which we maybe some of you know that we have a lot of different crops within a single plant species. So we've just selected for different types of features. So broccoli we've selected for flower buds, cabbage for that terminal bud, turnips we've selected crops for their root development, kohlrabi for stem, and so on. So we have a wide variety of vegetables that can serve as potential hosts. And we have a little bit of differences. We're starting to notice that some of these are more preferred than others, and that can have implications for pest management too. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I did want to also mention how important brassicas are to human health. I think this is really significant because as we've been seeing more Swede Midge in our urban gardens, some of the gardens have imposed brassica bans. So they're not allowing any of the growers to plant brassicas. And this is, to me, it's really sad because brassicas are amazing for human health. So we know that they're rich in vitamin C and E, carotenoids, all these really healthful phenolic compounds, antioxidants. They help fight cancer and degenerative diseases. They help stimulate the immune system, a good source of bioavailable calcium and iron. So in general, nutritionists recommend eating more of them. And to be honest, there's data suggests that we're really not eating enough brassicas. So of the 10 most popular vegetables, broccoli ranks 9th. So we, according to this study on consumer retail behaviors, only 52% of households purchased broccoli. And then we have cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and kale also in the top 20, but really relatively not popular vegetables at all. But globally, production has been increasing. So we've seen a 10.6% increase over the past decade. And we know that brassica crops remain popular in home and community gardens. A lot of people, especially are growing those leafy greens, collards, kale. I've seen a lot of them in community gardens. So it's a big disappointment that this pest is I think threatening production of brassicas when we really should be eating and growing more of them. All right, so luckily, we have some research that we can lean on that's been done by colleagues and folks up in the Northeast United States, Vermont, New York, Canada, have been dealing with this pest a lot longer than we have, and it's been more damaging there. So we're just starting to see it here and in other maybe places in the upper Midwest. But we know from this previous research, now we're starting to learn a little bit more about it. So most susceptible crops to damage based on these are kind of preference studies that have been done. Broccoli, cauliflower, kale, specifically red Russian kale. And I've seen this in our gardens too. They really, you can see this kale does not look right. All of that distorted growth. So this is a pretty symptomatic of what Swede midge damage looks like. And this is what a lot of our kale in the community gardens look like this year. Kohlrabi is also preferred, collards, Brussels sprouts. And then the crops that are less susceptible, they still serve as hosts, but they just don't seem to be quite as attractive, or the damage isn't quite as severe. They don't produce quite as many or host quite as many larvae. Things like bok choy, cabbage, particularly the Savoy and Napa, or the Chinese cabbage varieties. Lacinato kale, or dinosaur kale, or dino kale, if you call it that. Turnip, radish, and rutabaga don't produce as many or are less susceptible. So of these, broccoli and that red Russian kale seem to be the big superstars, really tasty and attractive to Swede midge. So keep that in mind as we're thinking of how crop selection might play a role in helping to suppress this pest. I'll also mention too, the harvestable plant part plays a role too. So if we're thinking broccoli and cauliflower, these head-forming vegetables, a single larvae or just one egg that hatches into one larvae is enough to destroy that head. So you have a higher risk with those particular crops than you do these leafy vegetables. Even with this kale that's pretty damaged, you're still getting some harvestable leaves from that crop. So leafy vegetables tend to be not, even though they're great hosts, you can still get market harvestable material from them, as opposed to these head-forming vegetables. So the question also is, we have a lot of brassica weeds, non-crop in the environment and the landscape that might potentially serve as hosts. So to what extent are these helping facilitate the spread and helping Swede Midge increase in population pressure? And the answer really is that we don't totally know yet. We still have more research to do in this area. But some of the hosts that have weedy hosts that have been known to host Swede Midge are field mustard, wild mustard, shepherd's purse, which is really common around here. And then there's some non-hosts too. And so it's interesting too and important to recognize crops that are brassicas that do not support Swede Midge development, because potentially there might be some opportunities here for breeding resistance in the future if this becomes a more significant pest. And in general, according to a study done by a colleague at University of Vermont, weedy species were found to host fewer Swede Midge larvae than domesticated brassica crops. So it seems to be they prefer our cultivated crops that we're growing in our gardens. All right, the case in Minnesota, we have 70 different species of brassica plants. This is both cultivated and non-cultivated grown here. So lots of opportunity for host plants for infestation. The first occurrence was in 2016 in Hennepin and Ramsey County. So this is where Minneapolis and St. Paul, our metro area, is. And then since then, we've seen a huge increase in populations in our metro areas and community gardens. So we decided the MDA was lacking resources to do their trapping, so we wanted to get some funds to monitor Swede Midge in urban and community garden sites. And so we found 5 different hosts, or 6 different locations actually. 4 of these were community gardens: St. Anthony Park, Merriam Station, Eleanor Graham, and Midway Green Spirit. These are all in St. Paul and Ramsey County. And then the Student Organic Farm, which is on the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus. So this is there. And then we also looked at it in a broccolini trial that we were also monitoring a broccolini trial on the St. Paul campus. So we use those Jackson traps, like I showed you before, which are baited with that female sex pheromone, looking at males. And here's what we found in 2022. And here we have the different locations indicated by different colors. You can see these 3, we assume these are their generational peaks. So we can see maybe 3 distinct generations. Here's adults emerging here in late June. We see another one late August, maybe another peak in mid-September. And then in 2023, we see maybe similar peaks. This one was at the same time, late June, August, and early October. But what I want to also point out is this numbers on these scales. So our highest trap catch was close to 30, 27 or 28 adults. This is a 44% increase in the peak populations from 2022 to 2023. And we also started to see a lot of that population buildup happening at our Student Organic Farm. And we can attribute this to the wide variety of brassicas that we were growing without using pesticide sprays. And there's also a lot of canola and brassica cover crops and other brassica research happening. So plenty of hosts, not a lot of sprays being used, offering that opportunity for population buildup, which is bad for production, obviously, but good for research, right? So this is something we'll continue to explore. So since this population has been increasing we've been seeing a lot more damage in community gardens. As a result, some of the gardens have been imposing brassica bans in response to Swede Midge. So we wanted to do a survey of Minneapolis and St. Paul gardeners to see to what extent this pest was on growers' radars, how extensive was maybe the damage without doing these costly kind of monitoring surveys. So we deployed a grower survey through our Urban Ag Network, through Master Gardeners and the Twin City Metro Growers Network. This September, we received 28 responses. And I'm going to summarize some of these. So looking at what crops were most popular, 64% of growers were producing those leafy greens, collard greens, and kale. Smaller amounts of cabbage, radish, broccoli, and cauliflower. Asian greens were also grown. And then we had, some of those growers in those hot spots saying, no, we're not allowed to grow brassicas in our garden anymore. And then we asked about observing Swede Midge damage. We showed a few pictures that were indicative of what the damage might look like. 39% of the gardeners, so the majority in this survey, were saying that, yes, they had experienced damage. 21% no. 32% maybe unsure because, the damage can be kind of hard to see. And then here's that slice of the growers who weren't growing brassicas. And then when we asked about what management strategies folks wanted to learn more about, we heard we offered a list of potential different strategies that were applicable maybe for urban growers. A lot of folks, 78% wanting to learn more about crop selection to reduce damage. So that kind of ties into the information that I just showed around which plants are most susceptible. Red Russian kale being top, broccoli also being top, certainly cauliflower as well. Using row covers or exclusion techniques. So here's an example. Here's what one grower did that had been experiencing a lot of damage. They wanted to protect their broccoli using row covers. That this strategy works for preventing new infestations. But if this soil is infested, Swede Midge might emerge. The pupae might emerge into adults from that soil and then infest the plants. So that's another thing we have to keep in mind. Folks were interested in botanical-based repellents. So these would work maybe by preventing the females from laying eggs, repelling them. Biological control, folks are interested in that. And I have more to say on this, but the bad news is we really don't have anything that works very well, unfortunately, at this point. Using soil covers or barriers. So there's interest in putting landscape fabric or plastic mulches on the soil as a mulch, planting into it, and then maybe that can suppress new adults from emerging from the soil. And then mating disruption, which is an interesting one, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. So preliminary crop rotation recommendations advise growers to, you'd have to take brassica crops out of production for 3 years. So if you have infestation, the pupae can survive for a couple years. And so you really have to break that cycle, you have to avoid brassicas for that 3-year minimum. And you have to be 3,000 feet away. They are weak flyers. We're learning a little bit more about how far they can fly. They can't fly very far compared to a lot of other insects. So the other recommendation is if you have a barrier, like a windbreak or a hedgerow or something that's splitting your field. So on one side, you might have your brassicas and then you have your barrier. You can maybe plant a little closer, like 500 feet. But this isn't applicable in urban ag settings. We know we really have small plot sizes. We're growing on the small scale. A lot of our veg growers in Minnesota are small scale growers. So really you would have to, if you had an active infestation and you were further out from other farms or relatively isolated, you would have to put that 3-year kind of pause on brassicas to break that cycle. Or you'd reduce exposure of the susceptible development stages of host plants. So for example, I mentioned the heading vegetables are more susceptible at that earlier stage of growth. So once they're already heading, they're really not, you're not going to have a lot of damage. The Swede midge aren't going to be attracted to a mature kind of heading plant. So keeping that in mind and maybe covering your plants earlier is a way to reduce damage. Row covers and exclusion netting. So here's an experiment that we did. Here was the broccoli grown under row cover. So we're preventing females from laying their eggs. And then this is the same plot that was already infested without cover in St. Paul. So you can see there's no head forming. It's all this distorted growth. So netting can work really well. It's worked in previous studies. We can't use it on previously infested sites or sites where we suspect there might be pupae in the soil that can emerge, like I mentioned. And the good point is this will also prevent other brassica pests. So we've always had problems too with imported cabbage worm, flea beetles, all these other caterpillar pests that we get yearly on our brassicas. So this can help with that too. Caveats are the netting has to be, of course, free from holes or tears. The flies are very small, so it has to be fine enough to prevent them. Row covers could work, but this also affects the microclimate under that cover. So in really hot years, this can increase temperature or humidity and can potentially lead to diseases. So that's another consideration with covers. So there's not been a lot of research on this. I think that this is a potential area to expand because I think there's a lot of promise using black plastic or landscape fabric. So because Swede midge overwinter as pupae in the soil, if you provided a barrier, first of all, a barrier during the growing season that prevents the larvae from accessing to the soil to pupate, that's one strategy. Or you can cover maybe soil later in the year, at the end of the year, to prevent pupae that are already in the soil from emerging. So maybe two different ways we can use this. Solarization is also one of these things that we might investigate. I don't know how well it's going to work in really northern climates like ours, that have short growing seasons. We don't get enough heat or time under that plastic to really raise the temperatures and disrupt the insect and disease cycles, but it could be something that might be viable in areas in the south or southern areas, maybe not quite as north as us. And another thing to be aware of are these planting holes. So in this example, this is a pepper plant, but imagine if it's a cauliflower or brassica seedling, and that larvae pre-pupae is flinging itself from the plant, it could potentially access the soil through this planting hole. So that's another thing that we'll have to investigate. So other research has looked at these botanical-based repellents in organic systems that prevent oviposition, or the females from laying eggs on plants. So they've investigated garlic, eucalyptus, lemon, spearmint, and lemongrass. And in lab studies, these did really well. However, the downside, and I've seen this in my own research too with these compounds, is that we get really inconsistent field results. And this is because of the environment, and a lot of these things have volatile organic compounds that disperse in the environment. They don't persist. You have temperature, moisture, UV light that help break these things down in the natural environment. And so they kind of are limiting in that way. Perhaps adjuvants or other compounds can be added to these botanical-based repellents and make them last longer and work better. So that could be a potential. But phytotoxicity is also concerned. This is just a stock photo example, but this is what phytotoxicity might look like. So some of these compounds are oil-based, and then you get a negative plant response to them. So that's a constraining factor with some of these repellents. Biological control, there's not a lot. There's a parasitoid that's been found in Ontario, and the rates are really high, as high as 71% in ideal circumstances. It hasn't been tested in vegetable settings, so this is something that's kind of new. Nematodes, these roundworms that are naturally occurring in the soil can parasitize the pupae in the soil. This has also worked really well in lab settings. Field studies have been inconsistent, and a lot of this is because the soil conditions have to be just perfect, right? They have to be moist enough. They have to have certain textures. So soils that are higher in organic matter or higher in clay maybe are better for the nematode development. So lots of different factors that influence the efficacy of these things. And the same thing with these fungal or microbial-based sprays like Bovaria, Bassiana, also not great results. So, and these tend to be really expensive, so we can't really recommend them at this time. Mating disruption. So this is an area that's in development right now. It's worked really well for like codling moth and apples. Just being looked at for Swede Midge. Colleagues in Vermont are looking at this right now. And basically how it works is you have a pheromone dispenser that's emitting this synthetic female sex pheromone, and it confuses the males. So it interrupts their ability to find the females. So the research shows that these are working at disorienting the males. We have to learn a lot more about how they are deployed, whether or not they actually result in reduced crop damage. The pheromone is expensive, so there's all of these things that have to be considered before we can make this kind of recommendation. Organic pesticides, similarly to these microbial-based ones, are expensive and inconsistent. Although there have been preliminary, good promising data, I think looking at azadirachtin, which is neem, and it's a common pesticide used in organic systems. So soil drenches, potentially disrupting pupal development, and then foliar sprays may also be effective, but we need to look at this a little bit more. This is something you might try if you are actively dealing with Swede Midge. But another thing to keep in mind, we need to make sure that the products are labeled for Swede Midge. There's not as many out there. So the challenges are many. Swede Midge is only a problem in organic and no spray systems because the conventional growers are relying on systemic insecticides for a lot of their pre-existing brassica pests, these worms and caterpillars and things. And these work really well at managing Swede Midge in conventional production. So as a result, we also don't have a lot of tools that work for organic growers. There's not a lot of folks commercial growers who are complaining about this quite yet. And so I think once this maybe hits the radar of a lot of our organic and commercial growers, then maybe we'll have more opportunities for more research funding. But right now, the opportunities seem to be limited. We don't have a lot of specialist natural enemies, so we can't recommend conservation biocontrol for this particular pest, even though it's great for other pests in the system. And I know a lot of urban ag folks have this in their minds, protecting pollinators, planting flowers for the beneficials, and basically promoting biodiversity. So that's great. Continue to do that. From a personal note, this research is really expensive. So Swede Midge, here's laboratory colonies. So we have to grow the plants, the host plants, along to keep the insects alive, basically. So there's no diet, there's no easy way of rearing these things in the lab in which to do kind of controlled research. As we're seeing populations increase in St. Paul, we're going to have more opportunities to do field research. So that's, I guess, on the plus side, even though, we have these production challenges. So on the plus side, though, we have 20 years of research from folks in the Northeast US, New York, Vermont, and Canada. So we're not starting at zero with this invasive, but it does seem challenging nonetheless, because there's a lot of unknowns, not a lot of people looking at it. What we're looking at here, we're going to continue our trials.
Mary, I was wondering, there was a quick question, and I thought you might address it in context of the research.
Sure.
Do you know what exact type of netting you're using? Like how fine does it have to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the picture that I showed earlier of the grower that had the exclusion in their garden plot, that was like row cover, the Agribond lightweight floating row cover. So that will work. We've also used a fine mesh netting for spotted winged Drosophila would also work for Swede Midge because they're similar sizes. So there's a lot more of that netting, I think, being sold by a lot of distributors. Dubois Agro Innovations, I think, had some. Johnny's probably sells some now. So the same net that will work for spotted wing should work for Swede Midge. Yeah. So other research we're looking at, we're thinking broccolini as an alternative to broccoli because broccoli is one of those hot crops. It forms that head. Doesn't take much to disrupt the development of that perfect head, but broccolini could potentially, because it has multiple shoots and it has a longer growing season, perhaps that might be an acceptable substitute. We're also going to be looking more at ground covers and mulches. Straw mulch and some of these organic mulches don't seem to be as effective as our plastic barriers. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. And then further exploration on nematodes and microbial-based controls in the field setting. And then also we think it's going to take integrated pest management takes kind of a multiple tactic approach. So what some of these things might look like in combination and if we can get synergistic control. So in summary, it's spreading, it's slowly spreading, but it is nonetheless throughout the upper Midwest. And it's a threat to brassica vegetables, particularly those that are growing organic or no spray. They're hard to see at first to detect the damage. You'll need an expert to either ID those adults on the traps or to confirm damage on vegetables. And then what seems to work right now is that 3-year break to disrupt the cycle. If you're already infested, planting less susceptible crops. So some of those brassicas that aren't as great of hosts, like bok choy, a lot of those Asian vegetables, Savoy cabbage, the lacinato kale, maybe broccolini. Hopefully we'll have some good results from that research. And then exclusion seems to work with these row covers and ground covers that might suppress the pupil development. And yeah, I have some acknowledgements. Of course, this is a group effort. We have a lot of really great urban gardeners that have helped us and allowed us to do research on their garden sites. Student Organic Farm is lovely to have as a training farm and also a place to do organic research on our campus. And our funding is through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and NC SARE Graduate Student Grant. And with that, I can address any questions folks might have. And I'll maybe just go ahead and stop sharing here.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. That was extremely interesting and sad because we all love our brassicas too. So
I know, I don't think not growing brassicas doesn't feel like a solution at all for me.
So I did have a question that was way back in the chat. Jim Jasinski from OSU asked about, can you actually identify the insect on the trap, or do you actually need the genetic methods to do that well?
You can identify it on the trap. There's certain features, antennal features and things that we look at. It can be sometimes hard to distinguish from other midges in the same family, but the traps themselves should have that specific lure for this species. So yeah.
Okay. And anyone else can put information in the chat, but I also have allowed you to unmute yourself now. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, we can also do that by unmuting yourself at this point too.
And I'd also love it if folks could let me know. Are you seeing this? Do you have damage that you're seeing that you suspect might be Swede Midge? Has it been confirmed in your area?
I'm Lori, I'm with Cornell. My colleague, Christy Hopting, I think she's still on the call. She's done lots of the research that you've presented today.
Yes, Christy is way more of an expert on this pest than me. We were new at this, so thank you for all of your work, Christy.
Thank you, Christy. I'll just say I'm a plant pathologist by training, and I trapped a lot of Swede Midge this summer in Rochester, New York and Buffalo, New York. We have it, so yes, it's all over in our urban areas. Using a hand lens and a dissecting scope for me is pretty essential for IDing. It's hard to see by eye, but it is possible, like you said. So that's my experience.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
we're
a few
definitely-
quick characteristics to look at, but I'm so excited you gave this talk. I'm like taking a lot of notes, and thank you so much.
Christy, are there other things you want to add since we have your expertise on this webinar? I would love to hear about your thoughts for how urban growers might, and organic folks, other promising angles that we might be looking at for managing this pest.
Sure. So with the crop rotation, 3 years, we've actually we put out some new crop rotation recommendations, which I did put in the chat a few years ago. Yes, there's a very small percentage of the population that'll overwinter for more than 2 years, but I would say 90% of them are coming out the following year. And our trapping has shown that you can grow brassicas end of July, August, the year after you've had a heavy Swede Midge infestation. And then it's like most of them are out of the ground. And if there's no susceptible host crop through, say, till mid-July, they're gonna perish. So then you can come in with a fall planting of brassicas, because that's what I'm saying. You just have to, you can't give them a host crop first thing in the spring, or they'll get established on that.
So delaying that maybe planting time?
Yes,
could work?
yeah,
Yeah.
delaying spring and summer plantings. I would say you could go into the fall, and we've demonstrated that on farm, and they've been successful with that. Of course, you can't be planting infested transplants, or it defeats the purpose of rotating, or delaying the planting. So I put in the chat box the URL to that fact sheet with all the details of how to manage that. And then we actually have been plugging away at the ground barriers, and finally had a successful demonstration this year. When we pulled off the barriers July 21st, we had 80% marketable broccoli or better. When I pulled them off the end of June, that was too soon. So kind of have 3 weeks in there. I don't know, like right now I can recommend the 3rd week of July. We have to do more research to find out if you could get away with the 2nd week, or I don't know if it's a fine line or if it's weather dependent. And for whatever reason, we had greater success with landscape fabric than we did with like a plastic tarp. And we abandoned biodegradable mulch simply because it's so
It breaks down early.
yes, it breaks
Yeah,
down, it's
inconsistent,
likely
yeah.
to tear. So we had to go with something durable. We tried an early research, seeing if we could punch holes in it so that you could maybe grow another crop while you're crashing the species population, but they find the holes.
They do find the holes.
They find the holes. They absolutely find the holes. Yeah.
So the larvae will find the holes?
I think
Or
it's the adults that are merging underneath.
The adults will fly and find the hole, find the
They
way
will
out.
find the light. Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
that failed.
Oh.
So it has to be a complete coverage. And I suspect there's still something to do with the soil and moisture, because there's different soil moisture conditions underneath landscape fabric than there is with tarping. But yeah, so we're very excited about that, and we're looking to trial that on farm this year and continue with that research. So in an urban farm, the growers that we work with are very, very sensitive about taking ground out of production. But if you had a home gardener that had a bed that was really infested, their broccoli was really infested, potentially they could cover that up and just not use that, maybe move their garden over another 5 feet or something. I don't know, but that could be an option potentially, depending on how much Swede midge is in the neighborhood that are going to find their crops anyway. But it's kind of like keep crashing that population so that it continues to have to start over. And what's your tolerance of damage? Can you live with 5%? Can you live with 10%? Because that may be better than 50 or 80%.
Right.
So when we're working with the growers, we're always working with pros and cons and what is their market demands, and there's so many things to think about. And Swede midge management does look different on different farms.
Yeah.
In your case, and in the Northeast for vegetable growers, has this been getting worse? Or what is the population doing and the pressure and the damage? Do folks feel like they're better able to manage it than they first were when it first came on scene?
I think so. Like you mentioned, it's kind of an invisible pest. It's tiny. You can't find it. It can go undetected until a grower has 50% or loss or more. And it's very challenging to find it. So there's that aspect of it that people just get caught so far into it before they know they have a problem. Once they know they have a problem, we've made a lot of, the crop rotation is very effective. The issue is if you have just a small land base and you're growing brassica season long, that's a challenge. That's where I'm hoping the ground barriers, insect exclusion netting, picking which crops are susceptible, which aren't. There are many, many growers that have had to walk away from crown broccoli. I'm hoping we can bring that back. Because we have learned a lot more, like ground barriers is new now, and we can do more with exclusion netting. I think we've learned a lot over the past few years, and we're hoping to start another project up again with urban farmers, small organic growers, beginner farmers. Conventional growers don't seem to have much of a problem.
Good.
If neonicotinoids get banned, could be an issue.
Speaking of the different substances and chemicals, someone was asking about diatomaceous earth and its use. And also someone mentioned the stale bed technique. And I don't know what that is, but if you know what it is, could you explain it and if it's effective?
We have not looked at diatomaceous earth. Christy, have you looked maybe applying it to the soil? Would it prevent maybe pre-pupae or pupal development? I don't know.
That's surround, right? The white stuff? Or
That's kale and clay.
oh.
Yeah, diatomaceous earth would just be the diatom shells, you know.
Okay, off the top
Supposed
of
to
my
be abrasive to soft-bodied insects.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of if anybody has looked at that. Off the top of my head, I can't.
And I haven't come across anything in my reading on that either.
Yeah. Okay. And you've done a literature review recently. We've got a manuscript that's summarizing all these projects that have been done that hasn't, like, everything in one place. And I don't remember reading about that either, but I could be wrong.
Jim chimed in.
My first thought is that it would not work because they are the larvae are so protected.
Yeah. I think you'd have to just put, I mean, if it was going to work, you'd have to put a lot maybe on it. I don't think it would work.
And the stale
On the soil, yeah.
bed technique, I'm thinking they're just not disturbing the soil. They're within the top 2 centimeters. I mean, I guess that's kind of like delayed planting. Just let them all emerge without a host.
Are there effects on tilling? Tilling is, what does tilling do?
Well, originally they thought that deep plowing would help, or deep plowing in the fall would help because you're burying some of those pupa that have to come up 1 feet, 2 feet, when they're tiny. So it would just reduce the chances of the emergence the following spring. but some of Rebecca Hallett's early work with plowing, I remember where they did spring plowing and the Swede Midge emerged like crazy. And I think they just opened up the ground and they triggered them to come out.
Warmed up the soil or something and
Let it breathe, and they came
That's
out like,
right.
yeah, the spring tillage, spiked emergence.
Yeah.
And I do believe fall tillage could still help.
Right.
Because I mean, they're tiny. They're so tiny. It's gonna take them longer to get out from a foot deep than an inch. So I don't know if it's been scientifically proven, but theoretically it makes sense.
Ben from Michigan mentioned that they do struggle with it and that some farms have gone to rotating the plantings by farm if they're working as a collaborative. So that's an interesting strategy.
So happy to hear that. Yeah, crop rotation is very effective if it can be pulled off. And Ben, do you have growers that are returning the following year, but just avoiding spring and summer and going into fall? Or are they actually taking 1 or 2 years off?
At first they took like 2 or 3 years off. Now the growers that I know that are doing the collaborative thing, they don't do anything the same year on the same farm. They just do a lottery. So if someone did it in the fall, they're not going to be growing it in the spring of the following year. Oh, they might do it in the fall, actually. Yeah, they do it. If they do a fall, sometimes they'll do the next year's fall as well. But they make sure that they're not the first one in the spring. And if they do a spring planting, they're not doing a fall planting.
Okay. I'm looking at some of the other comments in the chat, and I'm sorry if I misspoke or confused anyone, but no, yet some of the community garden sites collectively decided at their garden that they weren't going to plant brassicas. It wasn't anything like, regulatory or foisted on them. It was, we're not doing it at our garden. But that's sad to me. That's sad because I'm a big brassica fan. Anyway.
If they have been out of brassicas for 1 or 2 years, they could potentially get back.
Right. And if they're far enough away, right, from other sources of reinfestation.
Yeah, like you just don't want to be growing brassicas season long and letting it build and build and build year after year after year. But you could put in spring broccoli and enjoy that, and then don't grow a really susceptible broccoli again until the following spring, or just as long as you give time for that population to crash. And if the neighbors are infested with Swede Midge, potentially they could use insect exclusion netting, which on a small scale is not that expensive.
Makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thought we had about using exclusion netting was to maybe in an urban farm, you've got your infested broccoli, and instead of doing a ground barrier, so you've got infested broccoli, and I'm just using broccoli as an example, infested collards, whatever it is. You've got your infested crop in the fall. That's where the Swede Midge are going to emerge the following spring. So maybe grow onions under exclusion netting and trap the Swede Midge in with a host that they don't like. If you're growing in permanent beds, or there's a block of ground that's definitive where because they're dropping to the ground, they're not flying. Where they're going to come out of the ground. If you can keep your infested sites separate, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But when you have exclusion netting, they're going to be emerging until mid-July. Definitely there's going to be a lot of them coming out of the ground until the end of June. So if you've got a crop under there that you need to be harvested, like you have to put a crop that you're not going to be wanting to get under the netting and let the Swede Midge out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I was thinking onions might be a fit for that, because you don't need to harvest them till you need to harvest them, which is usually mid-July for an early transplanted crop, or later if it's or later, yeah, like that's an early harvest for an onion.
I'm just seeing Jim's comment, pyrethroid treated netting. Yeah. Is
I
that what that's what they use for the mosquitoes, right? I think mosquitoes are resistant to it now, I read.
Well, pyrethroids have activity on the adults, so if they're coming in direct contact with they're trying to get into the netting because they smell the brassicas inside it, and it's coated with a pyrethroid.
Yeah.
Theoretically, yeah, I have all these dead Swede Midge bodies on the outside of your exclusion netting. And you
Is
can
that-
spray your own netting. I'm sure you can. I don't want to get into the legality of it, but theoretically it's possible.
Right. Is that product available still?
You can buy pyrethrins over the counter at Home Depot or pyrethroids.
Right. And you could theoretically treat your own
I would
agricot?
just set up the netting and then spray the netting.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, when we were building the cages, we had to create our own naturally infested ground. So I was growing kale under netting, and there was other pest problems in there, and I just sprayed right over top the netting to get at the aphids. It's like I had an aphid problem in my Swede Midge trial, and I want to keep the Swede Midge but get rid of the aphids. And I didn't want to remove the netting, so I just sprayed over top, and it worked.
Well, glad you were on this call, Christy. I'd
Yeah.
love to
Just
actually
really
get a
curious.
chance to meet you in person, but this was
Yeah, likewise. And I was just really curious what else was going on.
we've been working a lot with Yolanda.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Yeah, this has been very excellent. I've learned a lot, and I think everyone who probably participated also did. We're a little bit past the hour, so I did just want to kind of close up for folks. If people want to hang out for a little bit, I'm happy to hang around, but just so you all know, we are an active working group. So if you are interested in joining, the working group is open to extension professionals, university professionals, but also growers themselves. So if you're a grower who's interested in participating in the working group, please let us know. You can reach out to me. I sent you that email this morning with the link. We'd love to have more participation, and you can help us kind of direct and steer the directions we go in. So Laura is also the co-PI. So Laura, if you want to say anything before we wrap up.
No, well, I hope to see most of you back next week for our next webinar. And the only other thing I was going to add in terms of Swede Midge is that Indiana is a glaring hole in your map of where they occur. And I think it's just because we don't know what we're looking for. So I hope we can get some traps out, and Mary or Christy, maybe you can teach me so I can find them correctly, because I'm sure they're there. But
Yeah,
thank
we have the Swede Midge information site for the US. I think that's up and running again. Elizabeth Hogdon had taken it over since Tony Shelton retired. Honestly, I haven't looked it up myself personally, but there's a very, very good section in there on trapping for Swede Midge, where you go to get your supplies, what they look like at 10 times magnification, 30.
well, and they're one of the only midges that feed on the crown of those crops, right? Like if you can see the damage.
If there's damage and you have the larvae, if it looks like it's Swede Midge, it's a Swede Midge. I mean, yes, those traps can catch other midges. The pheromone traps can catch other midges.
But what are the chances of that, right?
Who cares if it's contaminated a little bit? The majority are going to be Swede Midge. So, and I was talking about identifying them on a sticky card, and Lori just spoke up. She's like, yeah, I just knew a few details I'm looking for: the beaded antennae, the long slender legs, the hairy wing. Like they beaded antennae really is the giveaway. It's so quick. You can almost see them with the naked eye. And
Awesome.
the larvae there, I have a video. If you just do a search, how to diagnose Swede Midge, I think it's a 1-minute video. Pops up,
Oh, nice.
super
Great.
easy. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, great.
Thank you all.
Yes. Thanks
would-
again, Mary, and thanks, yeah, to everyone. All right, we'll keep an eye on this, right? And I'm
Laura
saving,
just posted the video in the chat.
there's a lot of good stuff coming through the chat, so I keep saving it as we add.
Oh, good, good.
I'll try to circulate these resources
Yeah,
as part of the follow-up email on Friday.
yeah. So we want to bring broccoli back.
Yes.
We're bringing broccoli back.
I see the
That's my goal.
t-shirts and pins.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll see most of you next week as well.
Yep, next Wednesday at noon Eastern time. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.